welcome to the Nintendo Power Retrospectives. I'm Count Zero. My school term is over for college, so I got time to start recording videos again. Huzzah! This episode, I'm taking a look at issue 18 for November in 1990. We got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Our cover game for this issue is Dr. Mario, and the cover is returning to classic diorama form. It's very good, and pretty much covers the premise of the game really well in just one fairly straightforward picture. The letters column has a theme section this time, with the magazine asking readers for their worst Nintendo nightmares. The general theme for these letters are power outages and unintended resets when the player is about to beat the game. However, the most notable one is from a parent whose son accidentally flushed 2 Game Boy games. However, they were able to achieve the games after a little work by a plumber and some lye. Fortunately, after some cleaning, both games worked just fine. It is nice to know that Game Boy cartridges can be just as durable and resilient as the system themselves. There's also a letter from a woman whose son had been legally blind and was only able to see faint blurs, but was able to strengthen his eyesight by playing NES games, presumably with some help from someone, possibly a relative, reading the on-screen text. I'd be interested to see more about this case, or if this was actually legit, and how long the sight recovery lasts, or if it's still, or if that person still has good eyesight now, thanks to the NES. Anyway, our first game being covered this issue is Solar Jetman for the NES. This is a exploration-based shooter, with the twist that you have to contend with gravity while making your way through the environment, with a bit of a lunar lander thing going on there. We get a list of power-ups, general strategies, and information on planets 2 through 13. Solar Jetman is a game that has promise, but also has some real difficulty problems. In particular, it's a little too hard to moderate your thrust to avoid bouncing off the walls due to having to fight gravity and your own momentum. It'd be one thing if the game just had you dealing with your own momentum, like computer space or asteroids, but putting your ship on a gravity well and having you have to contend with that as well is just a bit too much. I wouldn't mind it if the game eased you into it through some levels with little to no gravity, so you could learn how much your thrust your boosters gave before moving into having to managing your boosters plus a bunch of gravity, like starting out in asteroids or that sort of thing, and then getting to, oh, now we're on a planet with like half G, and then a full G, and then maybe gas giants or that sort of thing, someplace with serious gravitational pull. In short, I would say Solar Jetman is the kind of game that's actually due for a spiritual remake by an indie developer, with some information on everything we've learned since then about how to teach people how to play video games, both with what does work and what doesn't. From what I've seen, Pixel Junk Shooter might be that game, but I could be wrong. In this issue's Howard, Nestor, and a girl named Razor are checking out the Maniac Mansion. Nestor discovers the secret this time. In particular, he learns that you can move a bush out of the way to get into the basement from the outside. Little Nemo comes up next, and we have maps of almost every level, save for the last, and strategies for each. Now, I played the hell out of Little Nemo as a kid, and revisiting the game now, I remember why. The controls are really good, the worlds are incredibly imaginative, and the idea of switching between multiple companion critters over the course of the game, each critter having different abilities, allows for some very imaginative gameplay. Additionally, each of the abilities of your companion critters are very clear and very easy to figure out and intuitive based on what they are. The gopher digs, the frog can jump, the gorilla can punch and climb, all that sort of thing. If I was going to pick a problem with the game, it's that this game is kind of a pain without the level maps from Nintendo Power. With the maps, it's easy to find all the keys you need to get to beat the game, but without them, you may end up wandering through the level trying to find just that one key you need to progress through the level. Still, the game is a lot of fun, and I definitely recommend picking it up if you can find a copy. Unfortunately, as it's licensed from a film, and a film which is in turn licensed from a comic series, though admittedly one which I suspect is in the public domain due to its age, it's probably never going to make it on the Virtual Console, which makes me sad. So you're probably going to have to hunt for a physical copy and a system to play it on in order to play it. in Counselor's Corner, while Nintendo Power put out a strategy guide issue for Super Mario Bros. 3, that I covered previously, not everybody got that issue, so we get a whole bunch of repeat questions about Mario 3, such as information on finding the warp whistles. We also have some additional hits for Crystallis and a guide for leveling up in Tombs and Treasure. We then get to our cover game for this issue with Dr. Mario. We get strategies for the game. Unlike Nintendo's version of Tetris, as opposed to the Tengen version of Tetris, this game has a two-player mode, and this game also got a Game Boy port, which is covered this issue, so I'll handle that version here as well. Dr. Mario is what I describe as the next step in the evolution of the falling block puzzle game. You start at the beginning with Tetris, where you have to form horizontal lines across the board with your falling blocks. We then get Dr. Mario in columns, where you have to match 3 or more, or 4 or more items of the same color, respectively. And then from there, the evolution of the falling block puzzle game branches further to games like the Puyo Puyo series and Puzzle Fighter with their rising blocks, and Bejeweled and its clones with its stationary grid of gems, only adding new gems when the old ones are removed. What makes Dr. Mario more different than, say, Columns is that with Columns you're starting from a blank slate pretty much and building it up with progressively faster going blocks as you move on. Here you have the placement of stationary germs in the environment that you have to match in order to clear out sections of the game, clear out the board, and then letting you move on to the next board. So as the difficulty increases, so do the speed of the pills, but also so does the number of germs in the level environment, and in turn this also limits the space you have to place your pills and rotate your pills and do that all that sort of stuff. It really adds a lot to the game's difficulty and to the game's replayability. Though I will say that the NES version of this game is probably not colorblind friendly. The Game Boy version plays about as well as the NES version, but because it's a grayscale screen, the color blindness issue is fixed. So the multiplayer is also done over a link cable instead of being done on a split screen like with the Game Boy version, or like the NES versions. So honestly, I'd say if you have the gear for it, go with the NES version over the Game Boy version. You'll have more satisfying co-op experiences that way, and additionally, I mean, you're not really going to be able to play the Game Boy version on well, any system. I mean, you'll be able to play it on an actual Game Boy, and you'll be able to play it on the Game Boy Advance, but that's pretty much it. If you have an old Nintendo DS, which has the GBA slot, your Game Boy games aren't going to work on it. Anyway, DuckTales has received a Game Boy port, and this issue's guide covers the Amazon Jungle and Transylvania levels. And this game is abysmal, which is disappointing considering the NES game was amazing. The game tries to replicate the gameplay of the NES version, and a lot of the level designs of the NES version. But the screen and the sprites and how the levels are designed is just too cramped for the gameplay to work. A great example of this is the minecart sequence in Transylvania. When the cart drops down one level, Scrooge's head immediately pops back up. Now there was a time for the game to recognize that you press the down button before you hit the ground, so that, you know, you wouldn't take a hit on the level design, the environment. That wouldn't be a problem. But you don't have time to do that. You practically have to hit the button instantaneously. Similarly, some of the vine-to-vine platforming that just worked in the NES version of the game doesn't work here, and so I wasn't able to jump across those areas of level environments. Frankly, this version of DuckTales is an utter disappointment, which is a real shame just due to how good the original game was. Give this a miss, pick up the NES version instead. Speaking of NES ports, we have a Game Boy version of Robocop. We get a map of the third stage and notes on the smattering of other levels. Robocop for the Game Boy is about as good as the NES game, which means it's not very good. The game has one significant improvement from the original game. Robocop is able to jump. However, it still only has one life, and so it continues, meaning that the penalty for failure on the part of the player is higher, which is kind of something of a nuisance when we're dealing with a game that's meant to be played on the go in one sitting, presumably on a trip of some sort or another. And all of this, of course, also within the Game Boy's battery life. The Game Boy is also getting a football game with a port of NES Play Action Football. Well, honestly, it's not too surprising, as football's kind of a thing here in the U.S., so it kind of figures that the Game Boy would get a football game eventually, so we might as well see how well this genre works on the Game Boy. In short, it doesn't work. Like at all. The Game Boy can only handle 8 plays in the playbook per team, and the passing is really terrible too. As with the NES version, you don't pass to players, but to spots on the field, and you hope that the player you're passing to gets to the planned spot by the time the ball gets there, and the further back you go, the further you throw the ball. Additionally, the Game Boy can only handle 1 flickering player at a time, whereas in the NES version, the ball carrier flashed, and the player you were controlling flashed if you were controlling somebody else. So you knew who you needed to be going after, and who you were going after them with while on defense. Or, if you were on offense, who the ball carrier is and who you are, so you can screen the ball carrier's path. Assuming you weren't playing the ball carrier yourself, which you generally were. What this means, though, is that defense in the game is incredibly difficult, because you don't know who you're controlling. You know who you need to go after, but you have no idea where you are, where you need to go to get there. You could be guarding a receiver, but if the player does a running play, you wouldn't know that. Same if you're on the wings, and the ball gets run up the middle, you don't know that you need to go back and then in, instead you just rush forward. It's kind of something of a mess. I would really not recommend playing this game. If you want to play action football, go with the NES version. For the classified information column, well, we have enough Game Boy games out now that we have a classified information column just for Game Boy games. The Castlevania games continue with Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse, a prequel depicting Trevor Belmont's first clash with Dracula and establishing the family history of vampire slaying, until we get later games which set the series even further back than that. We get a breakdown of the game's routes and maps for much of the game, including info on Trevor's 3 companions, Grant Dynasty, Sophia Belnades, and Alucard, the rebellious son of Count Dracula. Dracula 3 is a game in the series that I describe as a happy medium between the mostly non-linear gameplay of Castlevania II and the ultra-linear gameplay of the original Castlevania. With Castlevania 3, the game has a linear progression, but as you complete each level, your route branches. Further along the way, you'll find various companions who Trevor can take with him, and some of these companions, particularly Grant and Alucard, have abilities that let you access areas of the environment that you couldn't have otherwise accessed. Even better, it does all of this while retaining the series' tough but fair difficulty. So frankly, I'd say that Castlevania 3 is the best of the 3 8-bit games in the series, and definitely in the series' overall top 5. I'd probably put it at a comparable place to Rondo of Blood. In the top 30, among the other new titles, Wizardry is entering the list this issue at number 22. In the classified information column this issue, there's a tip for Super Mario Bros. 3 that lets you nullify Bowser's fire. There's also a nearly unlimited life code for Solstice that still doesn't fix the game's isometric perspective and the terrible platforming that comes with it. The Now Playing column now has a new format, focusing on new releases that probably aren't going to get feature coverage in the magazine, unless the game shows up in the top 30 and they get a really slow month. Of note, this issue is Pipe Dream, which would later become the hacking minigame in BioShock. Capcom also has what I think is their first RPG, Destiny of the Emperor, which was discussed on an episode of the Retronauts podcast, which I will link to in the show notes. In Packwatch, the developer of Shadowgate has another adventure game with Deja Vu. Also, Mega Man 3 is now on the way. However, all of this is overshadowed by a game that sadly will not get an official English translated release, but will, much later, get a fan-translated release through emulation. Though a official translated release was planned, and indeed the prototype of that game eventually made it out, which allowed the sort of fan-translated version to exist. By which I mean Earthbound for the NES. The game had a complete translation, as I mentioned earlier, made almost entirely complete, well, rather, until it was canceled. And that translation, though, is available online as a ROM for your NES emulator of choice. I'm not going to put a link in the show notes, but a little Google searching will find you a decent ROM, or either with the original translation or a slightly cleaned up fan translated version as well that you can play and enjoy. You want to look for Earthbound 0. Just searching for Earthbound will get you the SNES version, which I will get to cover and play and discuss later. Speaking of unreleased games, there's an announcement here of an NES version of SimCity, which would be cancelled in favor of a Super Nintendo release of SimCity. So, at least there's all well that ends well. I am kind of interested to see how far along they got with the NES version before they switched to the Super Nintendo version. Just kind of out of curiosity of the whole thing. We also get a rundown of games with weird heroes. Shadow of the Ninja, which has ninjas fighting super science villains. Werewolf, which features, well, a werewolf. Kabuki Quantum Fighter, which has a guy trapped in a computer with his computer avatar being that of a kabuki actor, sort of a cyberpunky thing. And Conquest of the Crystal Palace, which is actually a relatively mundane fantasy game. We also get a rundown of a few sports games. Also, Celebrity Profile is once again back this issue with an interview with Kadeem Hardison, who is, as of this issue, appearing on the NBC comedy A Different World, which is in turn a spin-off of The Cosby Show. Hardison would later voice the character of Rubber Band Man on the animated TV series Static Shock, based off the Milestone Comics superhero. And also he would appear in the game Beyond Two Souls, which brings us back into the video game field. My pick of the issue for this time is Castlevania III, which isn't surprising. It's definitely the best game of the series on the NES, and for that matter, okay, what game? It's up there for the top of the entire franchise. Certainly, honestly, I'd say it's probably one of the best NES games of all time. And, well, if you're want to get into the Castlevania series, this is one of those games you got to play in it. It's that big of a deal. On the two-player side of things, I want to go with the NES version of Dr. Mario. In my opinion, multiplayer puzzle games work best when you can see your opponent's screen. I mean, other games like racing games and first-person shooters, screen looking is certainly a negative, but with puzzle games, when you get the penalty blocks or whatever that come crashing down after you pull up a combo, there's a certain degree of satisfaction you get seeing that. And it's just a wonderful thing. From a Schadenfreude standpoint and the satisfaction of your totally getting to see how much you're kicking your opponent's butt. Two-player puzzle games are just perfect that way, and Dr. Mario really gets that. So, next issue, we come to the last of the designated strategy guide issues of Nintendo Power with the 4-player strategy guide. So, we'll be finding out how well these 4-player multi-tap games work when it's just one person playing them. So, until next time, if you enjoyed the show, please support the show on Patreon. I'm on summer vacation now, so I'll actually be able to get these out more regularly. And if I'm getting supported via Patreon, I'll be able to improve the show quality by getting better equipment, and also getting these things out a little more regularly, because I'll be able to put other things aside. So, until next time, thank you for watching.